Ready to make a spoilboard for your 3018 Pro? Then stick around because that's what we're doing today. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of James Dean Designs. Now today we're going to be making a spoilboard for the 3018 Pro. Now, as in some previous tutorials, this is based on the original guide by Graham Bland. And you can find the link to the full tutorial of his in the description below, because he goes into some detail that we don't necessarily cover in this video. Also, if you're watching this looking for a guide on how to do a spoilboard for the Prova, then again download that tutorial and have a read of it, because he talks about the slight differences that are needed to produce one for the Prova instead of the Pro. Also, in the description area you'll find links to all the different bits that we'll be using today and anything else useful for this tutorial, so definitely check it out. Now if you're here, you probably have an idea of why a spoilboard is useful, but I will just quickly run through why that is. Your bed isn't always perfectly level. It should be close, but sometimes it can be a little bit off. So what we do is fit a spoilboard and face it, which is just take a top layer off, and it means then your bed is perfectly level to your x-axis. More importantly, it means you can fully cut through different types of material without worrying about damaging the aluminium bed that's already on there. So it's got multi-purpose, multi-function, the spoilboard is really at the end of the day, and it just allows us to do more successful cuts and get more accuracy out of our machine. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the bits that we're going to need to work through today's tutorial. So obviously the first thing we need is a piece of MDF, but actually we need two pieces of MDF, and I'll explain this shortly. This is 180mm by 300mm and 6mm deep, or 1/4 inch. You'll also need a surfacing bit. The one I'm using today is 20mm in diameter. You can use anything as low as 13mm, but it can't be any lower than that for the code that we're using today. The other thing to note about a surfacing bit is they often have a thicker shank. This is a 1/4 inch shank, so as you can see it's much thicker than the typical bits that go in the 3018 Pro. As a result, you will need a collet insert to take that extra thickness. This one takes 6.5mm and it is the perfect fit for this. You can either buy these individually or you can often buy them in packs with multiple sizes. Again, all links will be provided in the description below to give you an idea of what it is you actually need. Next we'll need a 3.175 flat end mill or a 1/8 flat end mill. These are just from Smart and they will just be used for cutting the little slots that we'll be putting in the spoilboard shortly. It's an optional extra, but what we do at the end is put a grid on there, and we use something like a 10, 20 or 30 degree V-bit in order to engrave that grid onto the board, so you'll need one of those as well. They typically come with the machine when you purchase it. And finally, you'll need our favourite method for holding material down, which is blue tape and some sort of super glue or CA glue. Today we'll be using Star Bond. So obviously we want to make a spoilboard that still allows the slots in the aluminium bed to take the clamps, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But in order to cut slots through the material, it would either damage the aluminium bed or you would need to put a scrap piece of material underneath in order to protect it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. But we're going to be a bit more intelligent about this and actually make two boards at the same time, so that we have a secondary board when we need one, but it also provides the protection that we need when we're cutting through. So essentially what we're going to do is cut all the slots on one side, cut all the slots on the other side, flip both pieces over and do exactly the same again on each side. And this guarantees that we have two boards that are identical, all the slots are in the same place, and therefore when one is damaged later in the future we have a backup, and if we ever need to produce a spoilboard again we only need to do one in the future because we already have a base and a protection for it to work from. So we're going to use a piece of code to mill the slots in here, and we'll essentially do this 4 times. We'll go 1, 2, flip it over and go 3, 4. Now in order to make sure all these slots align, what we need to do is put a centre line down the piece of each material. Now we know this should be 180mm wide, so the middle of this will be 90mm. So we'll quickly mark 90 and we'll do it up the other end as well, mark 90 there, and draw a line between them. Now there is a little bit of room for error if you don't get this perfect, but obviously the closer you can get it, the more accurate your slots will come out. And we'll quickly do the same on the other side now. Now this next step isn't essential, but it will make your life that little bit easier when you're machining these shortly. Because we need to do 4 different sets of cuts and then like 2 on either side, it just helps to keep these held together, and it just makes everything align that little bit better. So what we're going to quickly do is just clamp them together, make sure they are actually aligned as best we can get them. I think that's pretty good. I'm just going to put a quick strip of blue tape overlapping the joint on both of the long edges, and this should just ensure that they stay together a little bit better for when we're moving things around shortly. As it's only blue tape, it also means it shouldn't get in the way of any of the machining that we're doing, so we're just going to stick that down, fold it around nice and tight, and stick it back on the underneath. And we'll do that on the opposite side as well. So before we actually start machining anything, we need to get an idea of how level our bed is in relation to the x-axis. Now they should be fairly close, but ideally we want to make sure it's less than ½ millimetre difference between any of the 4 corners. Now the way we're going to test this is basically get the bit to touch the bed in one corner. We're then going to raise it up 5 millimeters, send it over to the other side and slowly lower it down again to 5 millimeters. Now obviously if it touches the bed before it gets to that 5 millimeters, it means this corner's high. If it doesn't quite touch the bed, it means the corner's low. And what we should be able to gauge is what the difference is on all 4 corners. Now as I say, you want to keep it less than ½ millimeter because it will show up in some of the results later on when we're surfacing the bed. But if it is more than ½ mil out, what you can do is use something like thin washers or something to pack the brackets up underneath here, just to try and get it as level as possible. So I'm quickly going to run through this now and you should be able to see what I'm trying to achieve. So we know that is touching the bed, so we're going to raise this up by 5 millimeters. Send it over to the other side. Let's say send that over by about, I don't know, 250 millimeters. First I'm going to lower it down by 4 millimeters. See how close that gets us. And looks like there's still a bit of a gap, so I'm going to take that down at least 1 more millimeter. And there's still a gap just about, so I'm going to change the increments on the step size now and bring that down to 0.1, and then just slowly lower it down until it touches the bed, and that will tell me how much it's out in that corner. So 1, 2, just touching the bed now, so that means that that corner is 0.2 millimeters lower than the other side. If we bring that back up 0.2 millimeters and then bring it back up 5 millimeters and send it forward to the other corner, so we'll take that about 150 millimeters back. Or a little bit more, that's just landed on the gap, so I'm just going to push that back another 5 millimeters maybe. There we are. We're going to lower that down 5 millimeters again. And again it is just above the surface of the bed, so we'll change the increment again to 0.1 millimeters. Lower that down. And again that side is also 0.2 millimeters off, so that's within an acceptable tolerance. We'll raise that back up and again bring it back up another 5 millimeters. Send it back over to the other side. Do exactly the same in this 4th corner, so we're going to lower it down by 5 millimeters again, and actually that is perfectly touching the bed. So what that basically means after testing all 4 corners is this side of the bed is 0.2 millimeters lower than this side of the bed. As I say, that's an acceptable tolerance to work with. If yours is more than that, you may just need to, as I say, pack one of the corners up or multiple corners, or even level it out, just so that you're roughly within that tolerance on all 4 corners. So what we've done now is just clamp our boards lightly to the bed, and I say lightly because there is still a bit of play in these and we can still move the bed about. And the reason that this is important, we want to get the boards as level with the y-axis as we can, and that's one of the reasons we drew this centre line. So what we're going to do is basically bring the bit to this edge here and line it up as central on that line as we possibly can. We're then going to send it back about 110mm this way and see how accurate it is on that line. And one of the reasons we've left the clamps slightly loose is so that we can adjust the bed slightly if that is out of alignment. So we're just going to do that now. We're going to pull this bit right back. And lower it down a little bit and just basically get it as close to the centre of that line as we possibly can. At this stage it doesn't need to be perfectly accurate in terms of the Z height, but it does matter in getting it central to that actual line itself. So that's a little bit off. We're going to move that over. Sometimes it can help to rotate the bit to see how it actually aligns to it. What I'm going to try and do is push that forward a little bit just so you can see the line itself. Little bit still to the left, so we'll take that over just by 1 more millimetre, or too much, 0.5, we'll pull it back. There we are, that is about centre. Now what we're going to do is just lift that up a little bit and send it back 110mm to see how accurate that is further back. Now if I lower that down again, that's actually pretty accurate. Now obviously if the line was off to one side or the other, you would just need to adjust your bed slightly to make sure that they're even and then come back to the start. But as I say, that's pretty accurate, so I'm going to clamp that down nice and tight in that position. You do be careful when you tighten clamps, they can move the bed, so we will just come back and check that shortly. Alright, let's come back to the beginning. Yeah, that appears to have stayed in place. Another great tip at this point is, because we've got to do 4 cuts and they need to stay in exactly the same place on the bed, it's a good idea to actually mark up on your aluminium bed where the boards sit, and it just makes it easier to keep the level later on. So putting some nice pencil marks on here, and that way I know later on when we spin the board round we've got the exact place that this will sit to do all 4 cuts. One thing I actually should have mentioned before actually clamping these down, the dimensions of the cuts we'll be making shortly are 110mm. So obviously the bed runs 180, so you've got a little bit of play either end. So the boards don't need to be exactly on the edge of the bed, they can sit within it a little bit. So this is about 15-20mm, and that should be more than sufficient to allow all the travel when doing the cutting shortly. So with the machine set up, let's take a look at the computer and the files. So when you download the link in the description, you'll get a collection of files like this. Make sure you unzip them and put them somewhere accessible like your desktop. Now we start with the PDF, that is the guide from Graham. Definitely have a read of it, there's lots of extra useful information in there. And then we have a series of different cutting files. We have the slots, which is what we're about to start with. We then have the engrave, which is the grid that we'll do at the very end, and we also have the face, which is basically where we level the board to make sure it's all parallel with the x-axis. And as you can see, Graham's done a great job of providing files for the Prova and the Pro as well. And if you read the guide, he also talks about what the HTML files as well if you want to use them. So what we'll do now is move over to UGS. Now I've already connected the machine, and what we're basically going to do is set the 0 point on the very edge of the board. So we know that it's centered to that line, but we also need to make sure that it starts right on the edge of the board for when we're about to begin the engraving. So we're just going to bring the step size down, maybe something like half a millimeter, and just keep moving it back until it's right over the edge of the board. And so essentially half of the bit should be hanging over. Now what I actually haven't mentioned yet, this is where we're using the 3.175 flat end mill or the 1/8 end mill. So this is what's installed at the moment. So we're just going to pull that back a little bit. And we'll keep going, it's nearly there. As I say, it should just be so roughly half of the bit is hanging off the edge of the material. Now with that in place, what we're going to do is basically set the 0 at that point. So we'll click reset 0. Now you're probably thinking, why haven't we set the Z height correctly at this point? Now you can either do this with a Z probe or by eye or what piece of paper, whatever is your favourite method. But the reason I haven't done it is you don't have to set the Z point at this area. Obviously half it's overhanging, so it's kind of difficult to see. So we're going to just lift this up slightly and move it back into the board by about 20 millimeters. And it's much easier to set it now that we're on the inside of the board. So we'll slowly lower this back down, and then we're just going to decrease the increments down to 0.2 millimeters and slowly lower that down until it touches the board. You can often tell just by rotating it whether it's gripping the board or not. Not quite there. There, I can just hear that scratching the board, so that's pretty close. Now, as we've already set the 0, we don't want to click reset 0 again. What we're actually going to do is come up to machine, come down to actions, and then come over to reset the Z0. So we're just setting the Z now, and it will remember the 0 for the X and Y that we've already done. Now if I lift this back up by a couple of millimeters, and what I can actually do now is click return to 0, and it should come to the very edge and start just overhanging that line, but also central with that line as we've already done. Perfect. So you can rotate the tool around just to check how it's looking on all sides, but I'm pretty happy with that and where it's sitting now. So what we'll do is load in the first file, or the same file that we're going to use 4 times for cutting every side. So we'll go open, and we'll go to the desktop because that's where the files are stored. We'll click in the spoilboard folder. Now the first one we're going to load in, as just mentioned, is the cut slots. Now as you will see, there is a Prova and Pro for all the other files, but not for the cut slot. The slots make no difference on which one you're using, so we'll open that up. And what you can see, I'll twist this slightly, is it's basically going to take multiple passes but cut all of these 4 slots that we want. We know the 0 is in place because it's set there. So basically, let's get this started. Now one bit of advice Graham does actually give in his guide is to lift the bit up off the board. He creates a lot of his files in Fusion 360, which doesn't always put the automatic retraction on before starting. So we're just going to lift this up by 5 millimeters. And then set the job off and let's get it going. So that's the first cut done. This is where the job actually ends. What we're going to do initially is just click return to 0. Then we're going to raise this up by, I don't know, about 20 millimeters. And then send it back by, I don't know, maybe another 120 millimeters back. And that just clears it out the way. So literally we're going to release this now, spin it round and do the opposite side. One thing I should mention is obviously you are machining MDF and this isn't great on your lungs. So if you're doing this anywhere like within a house or an unventilated area, make sure you're using something like a vacuum to get up all the dust as it's milling. So we'll quickly change this round now. Don't know if the camera can pick that up, but we can clearly see the lines that we put in earlier. So we just spin this round, line it all up with everything that we've already marked up. And we're good to go with the second set of cuts. Now obviously it does feel a little bit repetitive, but at the end of the day we get 2 spoil boards from doing this process. You'll also notice I'm only clamping just the edges of this. Although there is a bit of clearance from the cut, obviously you want to keep the clamps within about 10 millimeters of the edge, just so the bit doesn't touch it when it gets near to cutting. So with that held in place, if we click return to 0, perfect, we're good to start the second set of cuts. So we'll do exactly the same. We'll click return to 0, raise it up by 20mm, send it backwards, except this time now we'll actually flip the board over and do the grooves in the other side. Now, did anyone spot the mistake that I did on the last run? I didn't raise it up before starting the job, so we will just do that again. We'll raise it up 20mm and let the job start. So at this point you should have perfectly aligned slots between the top and bottom boards. We'll do this procedure one more time and that should be all the cuts done on the board. So that's all the slots cut. Let's remove this off the bed now. There we have it. So there is a slight overlap in the cuts where they haven't perfectly aligned, but we're pretty happy with how that's come out, and we've got 2 spoil boards ready. So I've just wiped the bed down and given it a bit of a clean. Get as much dust off as you possibly can. I've also ran some sandpaper around the edges of the cuts just to make sure all the fray has been cleaned up. We're now ready to mount this to the bed. Now you could use things like clamps to hold it down. The problem is they just get in the way for future projects. So this is really where the blue tape and the glue start to come into play. Basically what we're going to do is apply a layer of blue tape all over the bed. Just cut out where the gaps are in the slots, and then on all the blue tape is apply a quick layer of super glue. Hold the board down on the bed for a while until it sets, and that'll give enough adhesion to hold the plate in place for all the future projects. So with all the blue tape applied, make sure everything's clean, and we're now going to apply a layer of glue. So the star bond that we're going to be applying today, we'll just run a quick like S squiggly line across every strip. If you've got any gaps in your tape like I have there, try and keep the glue away from those. You don't really want the glue touching the bed itself. Once we've applied the glue, we will drop the plate on, and as I say, this should be more or less a perfect fit. Get that in place and then use our clamps to actually hold it down. The glue will take a minute or two to dry, so you do have a bit of play time to get everything in place, but the more pressure you can put on it to hold it down, obviously the better adhesion you're going to get. So let's get the glue applied and get the bed actually held down in place. So generally speaking, any clamps you've got to hold it down, try and pay attention to the corners and make sure they're all held down, and then just give it a few minutes to let it all set. So the next step is to fit the surfacing bit in the collet insert and get all this set up ready for surfacing the bed. But before we do so, let's just briefly touch on tramming. Now what that basically means is how perpendicular your spindle is to the bed. Now if you imagine that your spindle is on a slight angle, when you're using a little bit like this, you won't really notice anything. But when you start using bigger bits like this, it basically emphasises how much of an angle that is. And when it's cutting, if it's at an angle, it will leave tram marks across your bed depending on how it's leaning or how it's cutting. Now, the slight issue with this is the 3018s don't really have any way of adjusting it. Sometimes you might tilt the gantry to allow for it, or you might try and adjust the holder of the spindle to compensate for any angle. Fortunately, most of these carriages do hold the spindle fairly perpendicular, so it's kind of good and bad. But if you've got any method just to double check it, I would suggest doing so. For example, taking off the collet nut and using something like small set squares in there to try and check how perpendicular it is to the bed. Now with that out of the way, let's get this installed and move on to surfacing the bed. Now people often have trouble getting these inserts out. They can be a bit fiddly because at the end of the day they're designed to stay in place. You can try wobbling them out, putting a bit of pressure underneath, and sometimes they pop out easy, sometimes they struggle. But then that came out fairly easy. If you are struggling, you can use something like a small electrical screwdriver to put it in the top and just apply a bit of pressure to one side and they usually pop out. With that released, let's drop the new one in, the bigger one. So click that in place. I'm going to slide that up and then drop it into the holder. Tighten it up with the spanners. And we're good to go with that. So what we're going to do now is surface the bed. And what that basically means is we're going to make sure this bit runs all over the bed, left to right, front to back, just to make sure it's been all cut at the same consistent height. Now, as we know from earlier, this side is 0.2mm lower, or this side is 0.2mm higher, however you want to say it. The program that we're going to use to actually cut everything will do 2 passes at 0.1mm. So the end result is it will take 0.2mm off the top of everything, or off the top of the highest point, I should say. Now, if your bed is more uneven than 0.2mm, you may just need to run this program several times. What we're aiming for is to make sure that the bit has taken a little bit of material off every single area of the bed. If you do it once, and let's say it's taken some off this side and not really touched that side, it means it's not done its job. It needs to take a layer off every single part of the bed in order to guarantee that it is flat. So we're going back to UGS now. I did have a power cut in between this, so that's why my screen's reset and everything's gone off it. Now what I've done down in this bottom left hand corner, which is where the job is going to start, is I've just placed a mark 5mm from the left and 5mm from the bottom. And what we're hoping to do is to get the centre of this bit on that little 5mm mark. So let's start by jogging it over to the left hand side, or the bottom left hand corner. So let's move it over about 140mm, and we'll bring it back about the same as well. Alright, let's lower the Z-axis down at this point. We'll bring that down by about 20mm to start. Now we'll just bring the measurements down and slowly control it into place for where we need it. So I'm just going to start by getting the X and Y as close as possible. Now the purpose of actually doing this is the bit should overhang the edge slightly, and when it does the full area of the bed, it should take off all the corners so that, as I say, the bed is perfectly level. Now that's getting close. Let's lower it down a bit. Not quite there, let's just reposition slightly. I think I'm fairly happy with that. On the X and Y, we will just lower it down slightly to make sure the Z is touching the bed. As I say, this is only going in increments of 0.1mm, so you do need to be quite precise about it just touching the top of the bed. Right, so as always, if you spin it slightly, you should feel that it just about catches the bed, a little bit of resistance, and that is it perfectly. So at that point we will reset the 0, and just for safety we will raise it back up by about 5mm, just as a safety clearance. Now we'll load in the surfacing program. We'll go open, and the one we're after is the facing for the Pro, not the Prova. So we'll click on Spoilboard Face Pro. Open that up. Now as you can see, if I just tilt this slightly, it is literally just doing a series of going forward and back, forward and back, forward and back, all the way over, and we can see this number over here on the right hand side, 10.2mm. So we know 10mm is the clearance height that it will do, and then it's adding the 0.2mm on for actually surfacing the board itself. Right, so with that done, let's start the job. So it only really started touching the bed at about halfway, and it did all of this but didn't really do the first section of the bed. So I'm going to lower it down another 0.2 millimeters and run at the whole surfacing program again. Now, just to correct myself from earlier, it does it in 0.2 mil in one pass as opposed to two separate 0.1 mil passes as I mentioned earlier. Now, a quick tip just so you can see if it really is touching the bed on every area, take a pencil and simply just scribble across the bed. Now, when it surfaces the bed, obviously it should take all of that off, so by the time it's finished you shouldn't be able to see any pencil marks. So let's lower this down another 0.2 mil, reset the 0 and send it back off again. Actually, we'll raise it back up by 5 mil for safety and send it on its way. So everything has now been faced, the pencil marks have all gone. If you have some high points in the corners, it's just because obviously it's a round bit and it doesn't always reach the extent of every corner. It's one of the reasons that I've gone for a slightly bigger bit other than the 13 mil. However, if you do have those raised corners, just use something like a piece of sandpaper or a sharp knife just to take them off and make sure everything is flat. So earlier on I mentioned about tramming. I can show you an actual example of what that looks like now because it happened whilst facing the board. As you can see on the photo on screen, there are some very faint lines appearing. They only really appear in certain lighting, but you can see them. If I run my finger over it, I barely feel them. If they're more pronounced than this, I may try and tackle it and re-tram the spindle just to get rid of all those lines, or sand the surface back a little bit to make it flatter, but as I say, I can barely feel them, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Now, essentially that's your spoil board done. You've cut it, you've fitted it, you've faced it, and everything is now parallel with the x-axis. However, there is one more enhancement we can do just to make it a bit better, and that's engrave a grid on top for alignment. Now I say alignment, not measurement, because you don't really measure things on the bed, and in order for that grid to be accurate to measurements, you would have to have done all the tuning steps on your stepper motors, which not everybody does. However, what it does mean is we can perfectly align things to our X and our Y axis and just get better results every time we start to machine them. So let's move back over, get that grid engraved, and that'll be the last step on the spoil board. So what I've done off camera is installed a 20-degree V-bit. It doesn't matter if it's 10, 20, 30 degrees as long as it is quite sharp and pointy, because the lines that we're trying to put in the bed are going to be very thin. One thing I also had to do was lower down my spindle in the carriage slightly because these bits are a little bit shorter, so I just needed to make sure it touched the top of the bed without bottoming out the Z-axis. Now, as I just stressed, this is an alignment grid, not a measurement grid. What you may see is when we carve this, the grid isn't perfectly parallel to the bed, because sometimes when you install the bed it can be at a slight angle, but what the grid lines will be perfectly parallel to is the Y-axis and the X-axis. As I say, just making it easier for us to align things on future jobs. So we'll come over to UGS now and we'll open up the spoilboard engrave profile. Now I've positioned the bit about 5 mil in from either end and it's just touching the top of the board. So at this point we'll click reset 0 and then we'll raise it up 5 millimeters for safety as we have done previously. And with that done, we can get the job started. So once the grid has been engraved, it may leave it slightly raised. Just go over it lightly with a bit of sandpaper just to take the raised edges off, and you should have a perfect grid ready at the end of it. So we've just cut, mounted, faced and engraved our spoil board. We even have one ready for when that needs replacing. Last bit of advice, if you've got something like a wax or a varnish, consider applying it to the top of your spoil board. Just makes it a little bit more durable and gets rid of some of that fuzziness you often get with freshly milled MDF. You can even go a step further if you've got a laser engraver and consider doing something like putting your logo in the middle, because well, it does look cool. Big thank you to Graham Bland for writing his tutorials. As I said at the start, do download and have a read of it because it goes into information that we don't often have time to cover in these videos, so it's well worth the time. You can find the link to that below, along with any links for bits and stuff that we've used on the machine, such as the flattening bit, the glue, that type of thing. Final thank you goes out to my Patreon supporters. You allow me to keep making these videos. It is really appreciated. If you want to get involved and support the channel, again follow the links in the description area. That is everything for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and comment below. I really do love chatting with everybody. But until then, I will see you on the next video.